Welcome back to the Kyle Olson Show. The Trump campaign held a major news conference on Thursday to detail their legal strategy going forward. Here to break it all down is Joel Pollak, senior editor-at-large at Breitbart News. So, Joel, Rudy Giuliani addressed the process of counting ballots in Michigan and Pennsylvania. What do they hope to achieve there?
So in both states, they're hoping that the courts will throw out enough ballots to put those states into President Trump's column. They have different approaches in each state based on different problems. And of course, each state has different election laws. So they've had to adopt different legal strategies in each case. But essentially, the goal is to have the state courts throw out enough of the vote, or to go through the state court system and appeal to the Supreme Court, which they hope will rule in their favor.
So the U.S. Supreme Court.
Correct.
Right. So they're, and you sort of answered, the direction that I was heading, but so they're compiling all of this evidence. They say that they've got affidavits, and we've written about those at Breitbart, of the various observers in these different states. They're talking to, all these various people. Where will all of this evidence ultimately be released, and where do you think this will ultimately play out?
Well, there are two parts to the evidence story. They have gathered affidavits from witnesses in different states who allege that there were improprieties or violations in these various states. They also have affidavits about the voting machines and the software. So that's the evidence they have. When you go into court, there's another kind of evidence which emerges in discovery. In a civil litigation, there's a process of discovery where each side has to provide the other side with evidence that might be relevant to their case. It's a unique feature of the American legal system, and it's one of the ways you actually do an investigation during a civil litigation process. So there's some evidence that is not in the control of the president's attorneys, that is entirely in the control of state election authorities, and the Trump campaign wants to get at that evidence. So they have some evidence, they need more evidence, they may get that evidence. It depends on whether the courts allow the lawsuits to get to that point. To get to discovery, you have to have a legal claim that can be relieved by the courts. If they're suing over a small number of ballots and it's not going to change the outcome, the court's not going to let them have discovery. But if they can make a convincing enough legal argument that there are enough votes at stake and the issues are serious enough, then they'll get to discovery and they'll get more evidence.
But this is a unique situation where you really have a deadline in terms of, the Electoral College meeting, the inauguration, all of that. And if you're having discovery and, these various actors turning over documents and all of that, is it possible that this situation could extend beyond when the Electoral College meets, extend beyond the inauguration?
It is possible. I wrote back in September, I think I was actually the first to write this, that given the probability of a disputed outcome because of vote by mail, it was possible that the election could be decided by the House of Representatives because no candidate would get a majority in the Electoral College. I still think that's a remote possibility, but that's what would happen. If you still have these disputes, it may be that the state legislatures intervene and say, we can't actually appoint electors to the Electoral College, or we have to make some sort of a proportional split, or whatever it is. You may end up in a situation where the electors decide nobody actually won, and we're going to leave it up to the House of Representatives. I think it's a very, very remote possibility, but it's not as remote as it once was. When I wrote about it in September, I gave it maybe 1 or 2 out of 100 chance. Right. Now I'd say it's more like 4 or 5. So it's definitely more likely, but not yet likely.
And the reality of that situation is a majority of the various representative groups from the 50 states are majority Republican. And so the way that could potentially play out in the U.S. House is Trump could actually end up getting reelected, correct?
He could end up getting reelected by the House, right? The 12th Amendment provides for this process, which hasn't been used since 1824, when John Quincy Adams was elected president over Andrew Jackson. But that is what the 12th Amendment allows, and it could conceivably see Donald Trump be elected. Now, it would presume that the Republicans in the House would vote for the president. There may be some state delegations that decide to do things differently. They may not like deciding the election this way. They might throw it to Biden. Who knows? But theoretically, at least, if Republicans hang together as a party, they should be able to elect the president.
Sidney Powell, who is on Trump's team with Rudy Giuliani and others, Jenna Ellis is another one. She has made some shocking claims about voting software and the ability to change vote totals. Explain the crux of that.
I'm going to give you the best explanation I can. I don't know all the ins and outs of it, but as far as I understand, the claim is that the voting machines process the votes using a software system that can be calibrated to assign a particular weight to votes from different candidates according to some kind of algorithm. And the claim she made is that the algorithm was designed to weight votes for Joe Biden more heavily than for Donald Trump. And the reason the counting had to be stopped, and I think that's disputed, by the way, I'm not sure it was stopped everywhere, but there's this idea that in the middle of the night, everything stopped and they found a bunch of new votes for Joe Biden. The argument is that there were simply so many people showing up unexpectedly for Donald Trump that the algorithm wasn't strong enough. In other words, they had it calibrated to weight votes to Joe Biden and to underweight them for Donald Trump. But even that formula wasn't good enough because there was such a turnout for Trump. So they had to stop and find a bunch of extra mail-in ballots. It's a narrative that fits some of the observed facts, but that doesn't mean it's correct. There are other ways of explaining the same thing, such as the idea that the system just counted the votes properly or as close to properly as it would under any other circumstance. And the problem with mail-in votes is that's how they work. They come in late. Anybody who's watched elections in California, particularly if you're a Republican, has had that same sinking feeling, winning on election day and then watching as these mail-in votes come in. And it's always tempting to assume it's fraud because it always looks and feels so unfair. Kamala Harris, by the way, in her race for California Attorney General, lost on election day back, I think it was in 2010. She was losing, and then the mail-in votes came in and she won. So we would have a very different election in 2020 if that hadn't been a feature of California's own vote by mail system. Once you've seen it a few times, and actually this year, Republicans won a couple of House seats in California that way, where Democrats were winning on election night and then the mail-in votes came in for Republicans. Republicans have learned in some places in California, at least, to compete with the mail-in votes. But the first time you've seen it, it's quite shocking and disheartening. So I can understand why people might come up with other explanations. I think the likelier explanation is that this is just what happens with mail-in votes. I don't think that everything that happened with mail-in votes was kosher, by the way. I think the Democrats probably did do some things that were not right, but I don't think it was down to the software. In any case, it's very hard to prove. She'll have a chance in court, hopefully, but that's the part of the story that I think is least credible. However, Rudy Giuliani said he doesn't need that part of the story to make his case, that just with the violations of the election law alone, violations of procedures on observers and so forth, signatures, just with that, he says they can overturn enough votes for President Trump to win the election. We'll see.
Well, and we keep hearing from the media and some like Mitt Romney that there's no evidence of, quote, widespread voter fraud. But fraud doesn't need to be widespread to be effective, does it?
No, it just needs to be targeted. In fact, you wouldn't want the fraud to be widespread because that would increase the chances you get caught. The idea that there's no widespread fraud it's just a red herring. Nobody's arguing there's widespread fraud. I saw Romney say something else, by the way, which really bothered me. Romney said that to allow the state legislatures to wade into the election would be undemocratic. Everything about this has been undemocratic. The Democrats changed the voting rules by suing. And they changed the voting rules by getting consent decrees from governors without the legislatures being involved at all. That's not democratic. So there's nothing democratic about the way our election has been set up in 2020. So it's just a ridiculous complaint.
And he didn't, my guess is he didn't say anything about that. But how do you think this is all going to turn out?
I think it's likeliest to end up with Joe Biden as president. But I think one thing that's important to remember is that Democrats always insist that their own candidates fight for every vote. So Donald Trump, who, remember, lived most of his political life as a Democrat, is just doing what Democrats demand of their own presidential candidates, which is to fight as hard as they can for every vote. He's doing that. That's what it looks like. This is what it looks like when you fight hard. And then he has said many times he'll respect the decisions of the courts. So I think the courts will decide. The odds are very much against him. So he's likely to lose. And again, it's not because of the merits of any particular individual claim. It's just like betting on the trifecta at the horse track. You know, when people did that, you can't just pick the winner. You've got to pick 1, 2, and 3. He's got to win in 3 states to overturn the results of the election. And he's got more than 3 to pick from, but he's still got to win at least 3 of those. And each of those is a low probability event. So it's really a long shot. So I would think that Joe Biden is the likely next president, but I think Donald Trump's got to make his case. He's got to be given room to make his case. That's what the rule of law requires. And everybody complaining about it should just chill.
Mm-hmm. Joe Pollak, Senior Editor-at-Large at Breitbart News. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you so much for joining me today. For more of my work, go to Breitbart.com or find me on Twitter, Kyle Olson 4. Use the same handle for Parler, Kyle Olson 4, KYLEOLSON and the number 4. This is The Kyle Olson Show.